The Earth had already formed. It had a surface, an atmosphere, and slowly growing seas. But there were no plants, no animals, not even the tiniest living cell. So how did life appear on this planet? The young Earth gradually cooled. Its surface hardened, although volcanoes were still erupting frequently and enormous objects from space continued to strike the planet. The atmosphere held vast amounts of water vapor. As the Earth cooled, that vapor condensed into tiny droplets. It began to rain. And it rained for a very long time. Water collected in the lower parts of the surface. Slowly, the first oceans formed. There were no fish swimming in them, no plants, no animals, perhaps not even a single living cell. But in the water, near volcanoes, inside cracks in the rocks, and in places such as these underwater vents, simple substances were coming into contact with one another. They received energy from sunlight, lightning, and volcanic heat. Some molecules broke apart, others joined together. New and increasingly complex molecules began to form. We still do not know exactly where the first important step towards life took place. Perhaps in the ocean, perhaps in a shallow pool that occasionally dried out, perhaps near a volcanic spring, or perhaps in mineral-rich geothermal pools like these, where hot water slowly deposited layer upon layer of minerals around itself. In the past, many people imagined the early oceans as one enormous soup filled with organic material. In this so-called primordial soup, molecules drifted freely, met one another, and gradually became more complex. Today we know that this picture is probably too simple to be the whole story. In an entire ocean, important molecules could easily have drifted too far apart. To form more complex systems, something had to bring them together and keep them close. Perhaps a shallow shoreline, perhaps a tiny hollow in a rock, perhaps the surface of a mineral. We do not know the exact place, but somewhere on the young Earth, chemistry was becoming more and more complex. And before long, strange systems appeared that did more than simply form. They began to help create new versions of themselves. The first steps towards life were so small that no one could ever have seen them. On the surfaces of rocks battered by waves, and inside hairline cracks too small to notice, the earliest processes leading towards life unfolded in the invisible world of molecules. Fat-like molecules also began to appear in the water. One part of these molecules was attracted to water, while another part tried to turn away from it. When enough of them gathered together, they could arrange themselves into thin membranes. Sometimes, these membranes curved around and closed completely, forming tiny bubble-like enclosures. For the first time, a small inner space was separated from the surrounding water. The membrane did not completely seal this inner space away from the outside world. Some small substances could pass through it, while others were held inside. A substance that entered could also be changed by reactions within the enclosure, leaving it unable to escape. In this way, the chemistry inside could become different from the chemistry outside. More and more complex reactions could take place within these tiny enclosed spaces. They became little chemical workshops. Over an immense span of time, these chemical workshops became more and more complex until the first true cells appeared. There was no sharp line separating lifeless chemistry from life. One slowly became the other. Sunlight passed through the waters of the shallow seas. Tiny cells drifted in the light. Some of them developed the ability to use the energy of sunlight. They took in water and carbon dioxide from their surroundings and used them to make their own food. We call this process photosynthesis. And while they worked, something new entered the water. Oxygen. At first, only a little was released. The oxygen dissolved into the seawater and reacted with substances already present there. But the photosynthetic cells kept working. The sun rose again and again. Light reached them, and more oxygen entered the water. Gradually, more oxygen was being produced than the environment could use up. At first, it accumulated in the sunlit waters close to the photosynthetic cells. Much later, it began to build up in the atmosphere as well. For many of the organisms already living on Earth, oxygen was dangerous. Until then, these cells had lived in a world with almost no oxygen at all. Some retreated to places where oxygen could not easily reach them. Others disappeared. But some cells adapted to its presence, and some went even further. They began to use oxygen themselves. With its help, they could release much more energy from their food. A new way of living began to spread. Meanwhile, high in the atmosphere, some of the oxygen was transformed into ozone. The growing ozone layer blocked more and more harmful ultraviolet radiation. Slowly, the surface of the Earth became a more protected place for life. Much later, cells with very different ways of living began to encounter one another in the water. A small cell drifted quietly with the current. A larger, soft-bodied cell moved towards it. It stretched out its flexible outer surface, wrapped itself around the smaller cell, and closed around it. The smaller cell disappeared inside. Now there were organisms that no longer made all of their own food. They ate other cells. They were not animals yet, but hunting had begun. Simple food chains were beginning to form, and the ability to engulf other cells would later play an important role in the rise of more complex life. There were still no large animals in the seas, but time was already working towards their arrival. New kinds of cells and the first simple food chains were preparing the way for a much more complex living world.